Part 1. My Cornish Childhood. It all happened because I was born in Cornwall on Midsummer's Day. As everyone, or at least everyone who has the good fortune to be Cornish, knows, no baby born in Cornwall on Midsummer's Day can be left alone for one moment on the day of its birth, or the fairies will steal it and put a changeling, a fairy child, in its place. The country house where I was born was called Parkhenver, which means in the old Cornish language a house standing in meadows. It was surrounded by trees and velvety lawns and, like so many Cornish houses, was haunted by a ghost. It was full of real Cornish servants whose minds were filled with folklore and age-old superstitions, as the duchy is not just an ordinary English county but a virtual Celtic island, still haunted by supernatural beings which modern progress has driven from their homes in other parts of the British Isles. So the excitement in the house reached fever pitch when the old retainer in the form of the parlour maid discovered that the nurse had wrapped the newborn baby in a blanket and left it on the bed in a spare room, since its mother was extremely ill and not expected to live. One by one the household crept in to look at the fairy baby. Had the good fairies brought it, or had the wicked fairies got in first? Was the baby dark with long black hair and claw-like hands, or was it fair, fragile and fairy-like and destined to bring luck to the house and all in it? As I was fat and fair and entirely devoid of hair, and had remained peacefully asleep during the summing up of this critical jury, it was decided that I had been brought by the good fairies. There was, however, one skeptic, but as she was half a foreigner, the River Tamar ran through her father's farm, and everyone born across the Tamar is a foreigner in Cornwall and must be treated as such. What could she know of fairy babies? She was soon put in her place. The old retainer picked me up, while the others held their breath in suspense. All Cornwall knows that the fairies, or the little people as they like to be called, whether good or bad, put a mark on all their fairy babies, which no human being can obliterate, the pixie ear, and there, for all to see, was my pixie ear, smooth and flat, and pointed at the top and no little roll around the edge like humans have. So all was well, and they looked on me as a child apart, from whom great fairy things were to be expected. All the fairies are supposed to be asked to the christening of a fairy baby and bring gifts of beauty, brains and wealth. My sister Mabel is said to have remarked, with sisterly frankness, that it was a pity that my mother was too ill to ask them. She added that mother wasn't Cornish and didn't believe in fairies, anyway. My mother came from Worcestershire and never lived down the fact that she was a foreigner and disliked Cornish pasties and saffron cake, and, worse still, refused to believe in the family ghost. But I think my father, who was Cornish through and through, must have forgotten for once his austere Victorian upbringing and consequent treatment of his family, and invited some of the less-known fairies to my christening, who gave me a gift of divining which was equal to his own, clairvoyance, clairaudience and a strange affinity with the wild beasts and birds, all of whom have never had the least fear of me and treat me as one of themselves. Even that king of song, the Australian lyrebird, whose shyness is as proverbial as his glorious voice, flew across a river and almost landed on my feet in the woods of New South Wales and chatted to his little wife without taking the least notice of me, while they scratched around with their large claws for crustaceans on which to feed. Mice will stay quite still when I pick them up and put them out of the room, and, in spite of my great dislike of rats, they have been known to climb on my lap, calmly sitting there cleaning their faces and polishing their whiskers, deliberately ignoring my desperate commands to depart. Still, the animals on which I seem to have the most effect are cats. They will come across wet fields of grass to rub against me, and even the most dignified and unsociable members of their species insist, with the regal and commanding dignity of their ancestors, the sacred cats of Egypt, that I pick them up and caress them. My first knowledge of divining came from my father when I was a child. He had the gift to a remarkable degree, inherited from his mother. The gift generally goes from father to daughter and mother to son. He married twice and was by no means a young man at the time of his second marriage. I was the younger of his second family of two. In spite of the fact that my grandmother was a product of the early Victorian era, she used to walk about with her little divining rod, dressed in a crinoline, and people living in our small town were most shocked and horrified, as they said it was most unladylike of Mrs. Penrose to use a divining rod. Such proceedings were only for men. When my father had to entertain a member of parliament or perhaps a bishop or some other visiting dignitary, all of whom seemed so awe-inspiring but painfully dull to a child, he always took them out into the grounds after lunch and got them to try for themselves if they had the power to divine for water. Our home was in the mining area of Cornwall and had tin and copper lodes running across it as well as streams of water. After picking a fresh hazel or willow forked stick and showing them how to hold it, my father would watch them with great interest to see if they had the gift or not, and then he would show them what the stick could do in the hands of a real diviner. He was a big, powerful man and always used a thick, strong divining rod, and I have often seen the rod skin the bark off itself and sometimes twist itself into a sort of rope in his hands, but nothing in the world would stop it from turning. I still retain a vivid recollection of a certain severe bishop being prevailed upon to try the rod, although he left no one under any delusion but that he strongly disapproved of the whole procedure. The rod turned with great violence in his hands in spite of his determination and strenuous efforts to stop it, much to his annoyance and consternation. Much as I disliked this forbidding personage, I owe him a debt of gratitude since he cleared up for me a childish puzzle which I could never understand and which I didn't dare ask anyone to explain for fear of being laughed at. Those were the days when grace was said before meals and my father gabbled something which always sounded to me like watery bawtery, sieve. May the Lord make us truly thankful. I wondered and wondered what it could be that was so very unpleasant that my father couldn't make himself thankful for it but had to ask the Lord to do it for him. So when the bishop was duly and properly asked to say grace and pronounced in a loud, sonorous voice, "For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful," I gave a great sigh of relief and looked on the bishop as a most clever person. But I still disliked him, and this unfortunate habit of taking violent likes and dislikes has stuck to me throughout my life. Although I realize it is quite wrong, I always find that I have reason for regret if I ignore it. When my father had finished showing his guests how to use the rod, he would then give it to me, for I could find water and minerals as easily and as quickly as he could, although I never told him so. I never had to learn how to divine, and I looked on it as a natural thing like riding a pony and, when I was older, finding the north with a compass. From all round the neighborhood people would come and ask my father to find water for them. I can never remember his refusing to do so. I can see him now slowly proceeding to the stables to find a groom who also had the gift and solemnly walking round the fields searching the hedges for a suitable hazel fork or, failing that, a willow rod, since in those days it was considered necessary to have a freshly cut rod with the sap in it. Now a piece of zinc or copper wire, or even a bit of fencing wire will do. I go still further and say that if none of these are available, one can work without them, using only one's bare hands, especially when finding water, in spite of the fact that I have only found one other person who could do it. I have never been able to teach anyone else how it is done. A surprising number of the Cornish tin mines were discovered by divining. But the great trouble in these mines was that the tin was hidden below a layer of copper, and it was a number of years before the tin was discovered. This proved a great trouble to the diviners also, as copper has a much stronger reaction on the diviner than tin, possibly because it is so much more magnetic, and for a long time diviners had no means of bypassing the copper and reaching the tin. Today this can be done in two ways. The first is for a diviner to hold a sample of tin in his hand in a small glass tube with a cork stopper until he is tuned into the vibration or wavelength given off by the tin, thereby cutting out the stronger emanation from the copper. This is similar to tuning in on the radio to London and cutting out New York. The other way is to do it mentally, by fixing one's mind on tin so firmly that one is quite impervious to the rays or emanations of the copper. My father was the first person to work out a system for telling the depth of water. This was based on the isosceles triangle. After finding a spot for digging a well, which was then vaguely marked within a yard or two, not like the present method of marking which must be accurate to 1 inch, the diviner turned his back on the marked spot and walked away, after having returned his rod to its original position, pointing upwards. The spot where the rod turned over sharply and pointed down was marked and measured back to the starting point, and that was said to give the depth of the water. In homogeneous soil this worked very well, but where there were several changes of strata this method was often hopelessly inaccurate. My father would doubtless have continued his investigations of this difficult, but all-important problem of depth, as divining was his great hobby, but he had his first serious illness when I was very young, and this gradually led to his being a complete invalid. I thus lost the valuable knowledge which he might have given me and which only came to me after many years' experience. Despite his austere nature, we had many links in common besides my gift for divining, for he shared my love for our beautiful home and our Cornish heritage. I wasn't at all friendly towards the ghost who lived in the house because he had a horrid habit of following one about and putting a hand on one's shoulder which got tighter and tighter till it felt like a claw going clean through the flesh. Sometimes he crept up behind the servants and threw them down like a sack of potatoes. He used to stand by my bed at night, often lifting the heavy window curtains straight out into the room on a still summer's evening and then letting them fall again, making all the curtain rings rattle in a terrifying manner. He was just as troublesome by day as by night, and many people saw him and said he looked like an ordinary man dressed in grey, who let them approach quite close and then vanished in front of their eyes. Even although I was frightened of him, I really agreed with the old retainer who said one day, when he was particularly noisy and troublesome, "Ease at it again. But I don't mind E's are E, but I wouldn't like no one else's E. Everything in Cornwall is called he, or E as the case may be, except a tomcat, and that's she." I have a shrewd idea that my father felt the same as the old retainer and myself. It was just part of the house and it was somehow bound up with him and part of himself. But as a child I had another way of loving things which he hadn't discovered, which was by feeling them. I liked to put my hands on the great blocks of pale grey granite of which our house was built because that was my way of talking to it. Also I placed my hands on trees because I could feel them growing inside and I knew which ones were really my friends, and which ones disliked humans. I loved to touch a dog or a horse, very lightly of course, for I knew then if I had a friend or an enemy. But of all my childhood's friends my pony was my greatest and dearest friend. He was called Rufus because his coat was red and he came from Dartmoor, where so many of the English ponies are born and bred. He was never broken and had never had anyone on his back but my sister and myself. As my sister was generally at school, he was, to all intents and purposes, my pony, and there was something almost uncanny about our friendship. I was never allowed to ride without a groom and Rufus was led by a leading rein which he hated as much as I did, but which promptly came off once we left the main road and reached the country lanes. My favourite ride was a disused road amongst the old mine dumps from the Cornish tin mines. Rufus knew the game as well as I did. We raced up one side of the dump and slipped and slithered down the other, round the little paths and up another and then back on the road in a wild gallop to catch up with the groom who kept the nervous, spirited black horse quiet by walking him slowly up and down. But one day Rufus thought he would change the game and it would be fun to stop suddenly in the wild gallop, which he did. I shot over his head and sat down with a terrible whump on the ground. Poor Rufus, when he realized that I was no longer on his back, turned round and gently nuzzled me with his soft nose in the most pathetic distress. The groom hastily picked me up, literally shaking with fright, as he knew he would be dismissed for disobeying orders and taking me off the leading rein. The worst disaster of all would be if I was forbidden to ride Rufus. So I was carefully dusted and tidied up and a conspiracy of silence entered into in which only my dear old nurse must be included as my many bruises would give it all away, anyway. But nothing mattered so long as my mother didn't know. She was very severe, especially with me, but then who but a Cornish mother could be expected to have any sympathy with a child who preferred walking about with a stupid piece of stick and declaring that water was underneath where she stood, which no one could prove anyway, to playing with dolls, or talking to trees, or bothering people to tell her about the stars and then asking silly, and awkward, questions as to what kept them up in the sky and why they didn't fall down on the lawn, and why birds could fly and we couldn't, and so on. But, perhaps, the thing my mother resented most was that at 7 I couldn't read. It was no use my trying to explain that the words wouldn't keep still and as soon as I looked at them, they slipped down the page, or went soaring up off the top. This was sheer laziness or crass stupidity to her way of thinking. This trait has worried me all my life and, although I learnt to overcome it to a great extent, it was not until I needed my first pair of reading glasses that a Harley Street specialist explained to me that it was lack of coordination, or more probably, a break in the coordination between the eyes, the brain, and the tongue, or in the case of music, which I couldn't read either, the fingers, because the notes of the music never stayed still any more than the words did. I still get paralyzed with nerves if I have to read anything out loud. I was certainly born ahead of my time, for I was born into a period when all children must be alike, and if they were not, they were really quite something to be ashamed of. All the talk of ghosts and Midsummer's Day babies and divining was so much rubbish to my mother and not quite nice. The curious fact that diviners cannot bathe or go into deep water wasn't understood either. When I turned bright purple and shivered like someone with the ague, and ended in having a form of lockjaw after being made to bathe in the cold English sea, it was an additional annoyance to my foreign, non-Cornish mother. So I was constantly in disgrace. But for all that, I was a sunny, happy, little child, and I always felt that I had a great golden light burning somewhere inside me. The happier I was, the brighter it grew, and when I rode Rufus, I was just one great ball of radiating light. My mother's lack of sympathy for me, her younger daughter, drove me much nearer to nature for consolation and gave me an understanding of animals and trees and flowers and a love for the earth itself, so that I could find water with my bare hands and know whether it was good and fit to drink. My father died after a long and painful illness. Then occurred one of the most tragic days of my life. The old retainer came to me one morning and told me that my mother wanted me. Her face was white and drawn, and I saw she had been crying. With her usual dignity, she was sitting at her desk writing. She barely looked up when I went in. The family used my second name Maud, a name which I still detest. I remember her words, every detail of her dress, her white handkerchief lying on the desk, and even the blue-grey paper she was writing on, as if they were burnt into my brain. In her soft, well-modulated voice, she said, "I do not want any scene, Maud, but I have sent for you to tell you that I have sold Parkenver." For a moment I was too stunned to speak. Not only Parkenver, but my whole world was collapsing on me like a terrible avalanche thundering down a mountainside. Then I gasped, "But you can't, it's us, you can't sell it." Immediately after, in a blinding flash, came the thought of Rufus. I hardly dared to say it, but I stammered out, "But, Rufus, oh, you can't have sold Rufus?" And my mother's calm voice saying, "Of course, Rufus and the horses have been sold. That is really a very silly question, isn't it?" Then she added, "You can go now," and quietly went on with her writing. How I got out of the room I don't know. As I opened the great, heavy mahogany door, I realized that I was in the dark, and that the light inside me had gone out, as if a lamp had been shattered by a huge black stone. I was to carry that black stone with me for the rest of my childhood. Grown-ups would have called it resentment. I called it my black stone. Although grown-ups talk of dying of a broken heart, children can die of that too, only children don't speak of it, because they know that it isn't the outside child but the little inside child that never stops talking, who dies. Somewhere inside me I always knew that when I crossed the Great Divide, Rufus would be waiting for me saddled and ready, and I should jump on his back and go careering down the heavenly roads looking for mine dumps, and then I should lose my black stone and find the great ball of golden light that I had when I was a child. End of part 1.